All right, good afternoon, class. We're going to start our unit this week, which is going to have to do with the ancient Greeks, and we're going to go right into the geographical features of Greece and Athens. So today we're going to be primarily talking about Athens, and tomorrow we are going to use Athens as a comparison to the other main city-state of Greece known as Sparta. So we're going to go over some of the differences, but today we're going to mostly focus on Athens as a city-state by itself. So let's get into some geographical features of both Greece as a nation as well as Athens. So Greece can best be considered a mountainous country made up of very small and large islands. Greek communities oftentimes developed independently because of their mountains. Thus, they were very diverse when it came to aspects of their culture, systems of government, and ways of life. As a result of these independent differences, directly associated with geographical factors, Greek civilizations became small city-states that operated as independent nations. As we were talking about, Sparta and Athens are considered two of these city-states that held a great deal of power when compared to some of their counterparts. So back on some of the geographical features as well as climate. Greece can best be considered a country that has a climate similar to ours here on Long Island. It has hot summers while cooler winters and adequate levels of rainfall. And as a result of this territory being made up of such a large number of islands, maritime travel became vital to each and every state. Moving on to more geographical features. Although Greece is comprised of mountainous geographical landscape, many of the islands and lands associated with each state had fertile soils, allowing growth of crops needed for survival. However, these mountainous landscapes urged Greeks to grow their crops in specific ways that adhered to their environment. So because of the mountainous landscape that comprised of Greece, they had to farm in certain ways in order to best benefit themselves. So one way they did this was by terrace farming. So terrace farming can best be described as a way in which farming is taken place, and it allowed farmers to utilize vertical landscapes, which because Greece consisted of so many mountains, this had to take place. And they were able to turn farmland into effective, manageable areas. And we also see the use of terrace farming in our later and earlier topics that we've discussed, including civilizations such as the Aztec and Incan empires. Some of the most important resources grown and harvested throughout the city-states had to do with both the types of soil they had as well as the climate. So grapes, grain, and olives were one of their staple products that they used to both as a form of subsistence to feed themselves as well as trade with other surrounding territories. Let's move on to some technological advancements in Athens. So when discussing Greek technological advancements, one way to describe why Athens was associated with many forms of innovative techniques can best be described as saying advancement through necessity, meaning that a nation will prosper in advancing or creating new forms of technology if they are in need in order to survive. So they will adapt to their surroundings around them. So it is also vital that valued and necessary resources exist within their environment, which allow them to benefit. So, for example, we see this correlation between necessary advancements when examining Greece's impressive navy that existed during its city-state rule. Its city-states' navies were not only used for protection as well as waging warfare, but also as an avenue of trade. Remember, in the geographical segment that we just talked about, Greece was consisted of many islands. So a navy or just maritime sea travel as a whole was very important in order for them to survive and become as powerful as they were. Technology advancements also existed as a result of scarcity. So this can be seen throughout the creation of aqueducts. That's main objective were to ferry waters into the cities from faraway lands. If not for these aqueducts, certain city-states, including Athens, would not have been able to exist in its present-day location because it was so far away from areas of fresh water, such as lakes and rivers. Moving on to Greek art and architecture, which became a staple part of both Athens as well as different city-states, including Sparta. So The first use of 3D on a flat surface by using different shades to give an illusion of depth. We can see this through different types of architecture, including the Parthenon or the Acropolis. There was a focus on the concept of ideal or beautiful and youthful, calm-looking expressions. We see this through many paintings, as well as the architecture as well. Depictions of gods, statues, the emphasis of elaborating on existing styles, such that came before them that they would see while conducting this maritime travel. So they were taking certain aspects of other people's culture and utilizing it within their own. Money devoted to buildings, theaters, stadiums, gymnasiums, and tombs. Examples of this architecture included the Parthenon, the Acropolis, as I mentioned before, the statue of Athena, statue of other statues, public buildings, columns, and the use of marble. There's also many others. Moving on to governmental structure. The people of Athens wanted to rule themselves and not have a king or queen. So Athens, by our notes, became the first democracy around 500 BC. And a democracy, as we've mentioned before, is a government in which all citizens have the equal right to vote. Unfortunately, because of the time period and the many differences that existed throughout the city-state itself, not all people had the right to the vote, but this was a very interesting and revolutionary aspect. This is this idea that people were allowed to vote and express their opinions, even though during this time it was only males, can still be seen as a very revolutionary period of time. Athens was a democracy because all citizens could vote, but only half the people in Athens were citizens because there was a large majority of slaves. This had to do with warfare and the way warfare was conducted. Instead of when Athens and other city-states took prisoners, there was a large emphasis on turning these prisoners into slaves that would be used to that they could be bought, they could be used to create this architecture that we've talked about. And like I said, although this was a democracy, not all people had the right to vote, including slaves as well as women and people born outside of Athens. Governmental structure continued. So each city-state was known as a polis, meaning that's what city-state means, and all had a formal set of government that was different depending on where you went. So the government held in Sparta was much different than the one held in Athens, but we'll go into Sparta more tomorrow. The Acropolis and Parthenon were governmental buildings where many of these governmental functions were held, such as voting. And a classical age of Greece produced great literature, poetry, philosophy, drama, philosophical thinkers, and art. So we see the likes of Aristotle and Socrates and other members. So how effective was Athens' government overall? So Athens is often referred to as the cradle of democracy, since it can be considered the first time this is ever seen throughout ancient history. The democracy flourished during the Golden Age of Athens, which was considered to have occurred during the 4th century BC. Under Pericles, was a direct democracy, meaning all the male citizens would gather during and discuss issues, and then would vote on them. However, Athenian democracy was flawed, as we were talking about in our other slide. So only males were allowed to vote and take part in governmental functions. So this made up approximately 10% of the population. Women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded from public affairs. The policy of ostracism also created some instability, as the assembly could exile speakers, leader by vote, if they feel that they were too powerful. So what did the daily lives consist of in ancient Greece? So for men, only men could be citizens, and men ran the government. Advancement in cultures, thinking, literature, philosophy, wealth, expansion, and trade were mostly seen to have occurred by males. We could see such philosophers as Socrates or Aristotle, as spoken before. There was a large reliance on slaves, and women opened up free time for men to discuss philosophy and participate in politics. So the role of women and the lives, the lives of consisted for women included women could not vote or hold office or own property, and did mostly household duties. Education involved spinning, weaving, and domestic arts. At 15 years old, girls were considered ready for marriage. The role of women, we'll see tomorrow, was much different in Spartan society, and women were given a lot more leeway and control over the household, as well as what they could do in life overall. So the final group I want to talk about really quick is slaves. So the ratio of slaves to free men was quite high, as historians estimate. That as much as 40% of Athens was comprised of slaves. Slaves were house servants, had few rights, and could gain some freedom from generous owners. But most of the time, slaves, when compared to Sparta, which we'll talk tomorrow, life for a slave in Athens was easier, but it still wasn't as, they still had, they weren't given many of the rights that a freed man would be given, or even women in that matter. Education in Athens. So education was very important in Athens. Boys went to school to learn how to read and write. They also learned many sports. Girls were not allowed to go to school or learn to play sports. The Greeks borrowed their alphabet from the Phoenicians. Most European languages, including English, borrowed ideas from the Greek alphabet. So, as a conclusion, we'll just do a quick exit ticket. What were some of the geographical difficulties faced by Athens during its rise to power? Name at least two and provide examples of the hardships involved. So we talked about the different types of farming that they would have to do, such as terrace farming, in order to create enough staple crops. Describe aspects of the day-to-day lives of either a man, woman, or a slave in the city of Athens. Think back to yesterday's lesson and describe some of the differences that occurred between Athens as well as other African kingdoms that we discussed. And the final question I'll have for you today is name one architectural innovation created by the Athenians. That's all for today. Tomorrow we're going to get into Sparta, and we'll use, after going over Sparta as its own city-state, we'll do a comparison between Athens and Sparta. And I think you'll be able to see that although both are considered Greek in nature, they did operate in very distinct ways that differed and caused conflict. And we could see this to occur because of the geographical features, as we talked about above. The mountainous landscape offered a lot of seclusion, and they were able to develop very differently. So that's all for today. Tomorrow we'll go over Sparta, and thank you all for participating today. Thanks a lot.